Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we'll be returning to one of our favorite topics on this show, the topic of education. Our guest tonight is John Chandler. He's the Vice President at St. Ignatius High School on the south side of Chicago. John, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, and it's an honor and a privilege to join you here this evening, Kevin, on I think one of the most critical and important topics that we face as a society today.
And it's always in the news, isn't it? In fact, even though this show will air sometime after tonight, but today, the president just signed a bill that eliminates the No Child Left Behind.
Yes, he did, and from a personal perspective, I think that this is a long overdue move. I think that trying to create an educational system that is kind of a cookie-cutter design from region to region, city to city, does no child any service as we try to bring about the appropriate educational process for each child in society.
So, although I agree with that, but how do we as a society then reconcile that with the idea of common standards or a common core as a common curriculum, but if there are certain expectations about what children should learn, then isn't there that commonality, and how do we reconcile that with the individual needs of students?
You know, it's a very good question, and I think that all we have to do is take a little step back in time and to see the core aspects of education that you and I both experienced as we were growing up. That you want to have children that are able to read, that they're able to compose and to write, that they're able to think, that they're able to accomplish arithmetic, mathematical calculations. Very, very basic aspects of skills that I don't think you need necessarily, legislation from the federal government telling you exactly what those skills are. I think it's pretty much common sense as it is common core.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because, as you probably know, the feds got pulled into Common Core. It was the governors of various states who originated this and
yes.
felt that they were really responding to their own constituents in trying to pull this together. It has become, as education does, it has become a political football.
Sure.
But I think the feds, and actually I just heard Arnie Duncan, the retiring Secretary of Education, talking today about this conflict, about what role does the federal government have. And even his position was that the federal government is not trying to dictate curriculum in any way, at least to his view, but it is trying to create equity and equality of opportunity.
Right, and I think I think there's some things that need to be done to address that, especially in the public sector. We all know that there's a great gap in the funding of public education, whether from city to city, district to district, even from state to state. And I think that as a country, we have not reared up to investing appropriately. And it's not just a matter of throwing more and more dollars, but it's how do you prepare excellent teachers? How do you rate those teachers and evaluate those teachers? How do you give them the tools to be successful in the classroom and the tools to be successful with very, very complex students? I think the student today is far less homogeneous in terms of their abilities to pay attention. Their skill sets need different attention than they did perhaps a generation or two or three before. And I think that that's one of the critical issues is how do we provide resources? And the resources are not always just money.
So you've raised a number of interesting questions, so let's see if we can answer a couple of them.
Sure.
So how do you prepare teachers, for example, to teach? What's lacking today and what needs to be switched or shifted around?
In our own school setting, which is obviously a little bit different.
It's a private school.
It's
so
a private
different
school,
set of rules.
Private school, religious school in nature. So first of all, we look at a recruitment for mission. Are they committed to education? Are they committed to working with young people? Are they committed to help form young people, both personally and academically? The second thing that we look for are the appropriate skill sets. Do they have the preparation in their academic training as well as the preparation in the techniques of teaching? Are they able to take a look at different ways of evaluation of students? Are they able to take a look at and recognize different learning styles of
So
students?
how do you assess all of that? I mean, if I'm a new teacher coming in and I've got a year or two, or maybe I'm right out of college,
Sure.
graduate school, how do you assess my ability to do that?
Well, before we even hire, we ask for a demonstration. Frequently, colleges today will have a program for teacher education where a teacher is filmed in action and the teacher is able to carry that portfolio with them. The second thing, that once we hire a teacher, we ask for a portfolio from a teacher each year. In other words, the teacher's goals are very clearly worked out between the supervisor and the teacher. The teacher is expected to initiate a professional growth program from the first year that they've come in, and the school funds that professional growth program. It's not a burden on the teacher to finance it, but it's the responsibility of the school. And the last aspect of it is that we have a very, very strong teacher evaluation system that consists of evaluation by administration, by peers, and by students. And that's how we kind of make our assessment on teaching.
Now, being a private school, of course, I'm imagining that there is no teachers union that you work with.
We have a teachers association. We have tenure. Tenure is achieved after 6 years. But tenure isn't just simply a time then for someone to kick back afterwards, that the evaluation process continues and the expectations continue. I think tenure is a recognition of excellence that has been achieved, but an invitation for excellence to continue.
And I would assume that the tenure is not just a matter of longevity.
No.
That you have to qualify for tenure.
You qualify for tenure, nor is our salary based on longevity. In our school, we don't have a step system that simply rewards teachers for lasting and surviving another year. What we are,
as hard as that can be sometimes.
As hard as it can be sometimes. So what we do with the compensation, our compensation is tied to teacher personal growth, professional growth, and the achievement of the students as well.
So this may be a little unfair question to ask, but how much of that model do you think, and I know you've been with you said before the show, you've been with St. Ignatius for how many years?
I've been blessed to be a part of the school for 41 years, Kevin.
A remarkable tenure, remarkable stretch. Do you think that these kinds of evaluative techniques, the kind of structure you've built at St. Ignatius, could be applied in a public school setting?
I think that you see that already applied in some very, very fine public school districts around the country. I think there is always the fear that somehow by asking for accountability among teachers, that somehow you are diminishing respect towards teachers. But I think that good teachers actually welcome that opportunity to show their strengths and to show the way in which they are innovating in the classroom. Now, you know, in the public sector, we have created, I believe, a system that rewards simply longevity or the number of degrees that are acquired.
And I think step system you were
the step
referring to
system,
earlier,
the step and ladder system. But I think if you take a look at research that has been done in that field, that neither longevity nor the number of degrees necessarily means that you're going to have a better teacher. But we've created a system where people expect to be rewarded on how many degrees they've acquired and how many years of service that they've put in.
When St. Ignatius is not as bound to that particular model,
correct? Correct.
So let me come back to something you said earlier about how technology has changed things and how kids growing up today are not the same as when you and I were young. But then, you know, there, as I'm sure you know, there is the counter argument that we hear a lot in America about, well, you know, still need reading, writing, and arithmetic, and you know, kids just need the same kind of discipline we had when we were young, and if you just do that, you know, why are they so different? Why is it so special? Do you feel that there really is this qualitative change in the student body and their preparedness, their expectations, their ability to learn? Has that really changed the extent we hear?
You know, I think there's certain common basic things that are going to transcend every generation. I think we have to understand that technology is another tool. It's a tool that has been brought into the educational forum much the way that pencils and papers were in the 19th century and typewriters perhaps in the 20th century. It does not replace good teaching. What good teaching provides is a way for students to learn how to think, how to process, how to discern, and then how to express themselves. And so the technology then should aid in that particular aspect. I think one of the things that I've noticed most in my own teaching career, and I still am fortunate to be able to teach a class each semester, is that the attention span of students has changed, that there's a much greater focus on the immediate. They expect everything immediately. They expect the answer immediately. And I think part of that is been brought about by the access to so much information. But I think students are drowning in information these days. And I think it's important for teachers to somehow bring students to an understanding of how do you sift through that, what is important, how do you get rid of all of the white noise that's out there that they're faced with, and to be able to find things that are important for the specific subjects that they're studying, or how do they take that information, that knowledge, and then move to the next step in the learning process.
Well, and it's interesting you say that, and as you're probably aware, there are counterexamples as well. The Waldorf schools, for example, who really eschew technology and actually have outposts in Silicon Valley where some of the Silicon Valley tech giants send their children to these schools without computers,
right,
because their sense is that can be a distraction, and that the fundamentals of clear thinking, well, the fundamentals of understanding the basics of writing and arithmetic, et cetera, but also the fundamentals of critical thinking can be done. Not only can they be done without computers, but the computers can be distracting in trying to teach that. Is that something that you guys at Ignatius wrestle with?
You know, I think we all wrestle with this, because I think that the verdict is not out yet, that the advent of technology in education is still relatively new. It's still something that I don't think we have a good assessment as to what is the long-term effect of it, or what's the long-term purpose of it. I think that as we look at it, we have to be very, very careful that, again, as I say, that the technology is not replacing good teaching, that the role of teacher is mentor. The role of the teacher is very much the way that Socrates might have described it, back in ancient times. And that is to be able to create a schola, a gathering of individuals that are studying and learning and sharing and not only with their teachers, but amongst themselves.
Just remember, Socrates was put to death for thinking that way.
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. I think a lot of good teachers have been through the course of centuries, Kevin, on that.
So let's talk a little bit about, speaking of good teachers, St. Ignatius is a Jesuit school.
Yes.
And the tradition of the Jesuits, who are educators and have been educators for centuries. So talk a little bit about that, about working in Jesuit school and understanding that kind of Jesuit tradition.
Sure. I think that one of the things that we always have to be careful about is that when you say that we've been doing something for centuries, are we sclerotic and arthritic in our views and our perspective? But I think that a Jesuit school is as fresh today in its mindset and its approach towards education as it was when we started our first school in Sicily 450 years ago. And the reason I say that is that a Jesuit education, first of all, tries to prepare a balance between the humanities and the sciences, so that in a Jesuit education, a child is given the opportunity to explore his talents, his interests, as well as to stretch and to take courses and coursework that he might not ordinarily have thought. So balance between the humanities and the sciences, that's one thing. Secondly, a Jesuit education is to teach a young man, a young woman, how to think, how to take that knowledge and arrive at conclusions, and how to then apply that to the situations that they will experience, whether in life or in their careers. So the last thing that a Jesuit model is based on is repetition, is just memorization. It's just kind of, we wouldn't crack open the skull and pour in all the information and say, okay, you have it. So discernment is an important aspect of Jesuit education for a student.
Now, you talked a minute ago about the balance between the humanities and the sciences. And as I'm sure you know, the emphasis on STEM courses, science, technology, and math, is all the rage.
Yes.
And an acquaintance of mine who spent a lot of time working in Chicago public schools told me she was working with a team that's trying to get STEAM in place, which adds an A for arts.
Arts, right.
So there seems to be this emphasis throughout the country on the technology and science and math side. And we see in many charter schools, for example, they're, the Science Academy, or
They're very
math and
specialized
science.
schools, sure.
Very specialized. And you don't see very many art schools. I mean, you see far more of these technology, science, and math. Is it being overemphasized?
In my opinion, we're missing a very important formational aspect for 14 to 18-year-olds. If you do not expose a child as broadly to a variety of different disciplines, they're never going to have that experience, because when they get to college, they choose their careers, they're going to be on a very narrow path. I think that you can wisely blend both. I know at St. Ignatius there's always tremendous pressure among families. They want their children to have as much science and math as possible, because it's become such a gatekeeper for colleges and universities. And we provide them with that opportunity, but we do not cast aside then that focus on the humanities. In other words, being able to be articulate, being able to write, being able to express one's thoughts. And I think you need that balance. Otherwise, what you do is you create a society of, I think the word is autonomons or something.
Automatons, right.
Automatons, where they're simply going through information, they're going through data, they're going through formulas and stuff like that, without any regards to the world that's existing around them and the implication that that world has.
Well, in fact, it's interesting you bring that up. One of the studies about why Silicon Valley, even though it is so tech-focused, but why it developed in the United States instead of, for example, Japan, where the students were, education is very structured and very strict, and kids go to school for a long time, and they do a lot of homework, and it's very focused. And yet, Silicon Valley happened in the United States, not in Japan. And Japan played catch-up, and there are, of course, technology companies there that are successful. But why was that? And the thinking here was that it's what you're talking about, that it wasn't that highly structured, highly rigid, highly focused education where the student is so directed that there's no chance to check out the boundaries and see where other things lie. And in the US, where there was a much more open and kind of creative thought process there, you began to see, even though it was technology, you saw people, a phrase I've come to hate, thinking outside the box.
Correct.
Because they could. They were raised that way. And so their education allowed them to do that, whereas in other countries it wasn't that way.
And I think you've seen that same thing translate into China. China is great at replicating, but is China very, very good at creating? And I think you see that in many parts of the world. In the United States, I think one of the key aspects has been is that we've allowed not only that creativity, but we've allowed that risk-taking. And I think that it's important to have students take that risk. Maybe they don't always get the answer correct the first time around, but they've tried. And that they learn from that mistake or from that error, or they understand why they made that mistake and that error. And I think that is a factor too that makes our educational system different here.
Well, it brings up another interesting study that I read not long ago about the Army and training new recruits how to disassemble the rifle. It's standard practice. And they tried a number of different approaches, but the one they found that worked best was they tried, taking them through a very structured class. They tried giving them instructions, doing all this. And the thing that worked best was they just gave them the rifle and said, here, take this apart and put it back together, with no instruction. Then after the student had really wrestled with it, then and only then did they take the students into the class and say, okay,
and show them how to do it.
Now that you've been through it, now that you've figured out the questions to ask, okay, now we'll give you some training.
Sure.
But it was that willingness to let them fumble, get lost, get stopped,
Right.
that allowed them then to understand what it was they didn't know. And when they came in, they were much better prepared.
And you know, I think that you raise a very valid point, not only for education in secondary schools, but I think that's also a critical component in elementary schools too. You know, the issue of allowing children to be children, allowing them to be creative. You know, maybe there's things that are going to happen that we'd rather not see happen sometimes, or they're going to, you know, fall down and skin their knee. But at least they've had that experience, and I think that that's very important as well.
Yeah, so experiential learning is the term I hear used for that. And is that something that St. Ignatius looks at, that kind of idea?
You know, I think that we recognize that students learn in a variety of different ways. You have some that learn tactically, some through the experiential. Some of them are very cerebral in their learning process. So I think that good teachers recognize in each of their students what is the best learning style for that student, and then evaluate that student based on that, not just always simply giving the 25 question true and false test or something like that, because maybe that's not the best way to judge whether or not a student understands.
And we always hear about class size. So what you're describing, where the teachers can individually assess each of their students and cater the lesson plan so that, I mean, it has to, you can't teach each student in a tutorial, but to cater individually enough. Is class size a relevant factor there?
You know, I think it does not hurt to have smaller class sizes. When I first started teaching, I think in my first class I had 49 students in an American history class and a Latin 1 class. And I think that obviously it was much easier for a child to be able to become the wallflower, to be the passive and not the participant in the class. So we have, at our school, we have an average class size is about 22, and then in some of the more advanced AP courses, that number might drop down to 16 or 17. So is there an exact number that's the best? I don't think so. I know so much of the issue of class size is driven by dollars, unfortunately. You know, what resources does a school have, public or private? But I do know that having a smaller class, in my own experience, has been, it's much easier to engage the entire group rather than allowing someone to stay on the periphery.
Another innovation, and one we've seen at the schools I sit on the board of public school, is the flipped classroom.
Yes.
And it's been tried just at a very experimental level, but has shown great promise. And the idea, as you know, our audience might not, is to use the class time to have the students do their homework and watch the lectures at home online. It's more work for the teacher because they have to create the lesson, put it online, be available online, and then help with the homework. But it has shown great promise. Is that something that Ignatius has looked
We've
at?
started that about 4 years ago when we moved to an iPad configuration in the school, so that the majority of our books and things are on an iPad, and so then it's very, very easy for the teacher to film their lesson. It's been, some folks find that to be a very attractive way of teaching. Others I don't think have embraced it yet. Again, I still think that the verdict is out, but what I do know that has happened is that it allows more time then in the classroom, and it's not just for allowing the kids to do the homework in the classroom, but it's also allow them to come back into the classroom and ask the questions or the things that they didn't get, or they maybe listened to it 2 or 3 times, ask that teacher, and then to find out that their classmates also share some of the same questions.
And at least in the classes I've seen, there's also a bit of class camaraderie because they can work on some of the problems together and figure out, oh, gee, I'm not the only one who's lost here. This is a hard concept.
Correct.
What we did see in one particular physics class was that they had covered as much material by February, and this is the same teacher. He taught both a flipped and a non-flipped class, and he said that by February he had covered as much material in the flipped class as he did the entire previous year in his non-flipped class. Now, he was a devotee, so he was someone who, he didn't just embrace it, he's the one who brought it into the school. So clearly he was really committed to this idea. But it does show that some of these more creative ideas can pay off with the right teacher, of course. It always comes back to that. and the right structure that allows this kind of experimentation to happen.
I think that, one of the challenges we face in education, whether private or public, is the sense of rigidity, that lack of being open to growth, open to at least trying, and I don't want to say experimenting, because that sounds kind of evil, that you're experimenting in a classroom.
Experimenting on the children, oh my
On the
goodness.
children, exactly.
Yes.
But at least allowing different methodologies to be employed in the classroom. And I think that's one of the things that has begun to change, but I'm not so sure yet it has been embraced more broadly. I think there's still an awful lot of classrooms where the teacher is standing up in the front of the room and putting stuff on the whiteboard or marking something on the iPad and projecting it, and the students are just kind of sitting in the class. And that's a shame, because as I go back to what I said before, I think students today, their attention spans are not as long as they were in the past. I don't think they're as patient for information. And so if you just embrace that one particular style, it doesn't always work.
So why do you think that the attention spans are so much shorter today?
I think the electronic world that we live in, everything being instant. If they don't like something, they can switch the channel. If they want an answer to something, they can go to Wikipedia or Google it. Or if they want to communicate with their friends, they just text them or Instagram them. So there's that expectation that everything has to be in the here and now, and not something that takes time to process. I mean, when was the last time that you saw children really sitting down writing letters to somebody, other than a thank you note for their Christmas gift? But
That they were forced to do by their parents.
That they were
right?
forced to do by their parents. So they're expecting instant. And I think that the unfortunate thing is that it does not allow information to settle in for people to cogitate, or for students to cogitate on the material.
It's the argument in favor of books versus links.
Yes.
That books allow you to take time and think through it and concentrate over a longer period of time.
Correct. Without always having the ability to be distracted. I know in a class, and it's nice to be able to have a student that can, check the LIBOR rate, and tell you exactly what it is, or what was the Hang Seng Index this morning. On the other hand, is that as important for them to be able to always pull up immediately, rather than to focus on, what's driving the Hang Seng Index, or, why have LIBOR rates been dropping, or something like that. And I think that that's something we miss. Again, it goes back to what I said earlier. We have available so much information. How do we sift through that?
And I guess that's one of the great challenges of modern education, is to coordinate. I mean, it's no longer a matter of memorizing facts, because they're all to be found at the snap of
Instantly.
a finger.
Correct.
Right?
I think we also, on just a little different topic, Kevin, and I think is that we as a society have a great responsibility. And I don't think we take it very strongly across the board. We have one 4-year opportunity to educate young people in high school, 8 years in grammar school. If we are not successful, there's no going back. We cannot, say, oh, well, let's go do it over again. Let's repeat it. We have one opportunity, and it is incumbent upon us, whether in the public or the private sector, to make the best effort in educating and giving those opportunities to each child.
I can't think of a better way to sum up our interview. And believe it or not, our time is up.
Well,
John,
thank you, Kevin, very much. A pleasure.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can see us every Saturday night on Comcast Channel 19 at 8 o'clock, and find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.